The ocean was the invisible stage of silenced crimes. Beneath the waters of the Atlantic and the Pacific, submarine commanders decided who lived and who died. Shipwreck survivors machine-gunned, hospital ships sunk, prisoners exterminated. They were celebrated as heroes, but they left behind a sea stained with blood and secrets without justice. Alexander Marinesko, in the shadows of the Soviet abyss. When the ocean turned into night and silence, when the cold seeped through the hatches and all that remained of a man was the vigil and the dizziness, that was where Alexander Ivanovich Marinesko felt most alive. Born in 1913 in the port city of Odessa, son of a Romanian sailor and a Ukrainian mother, he grew up among smells of salt and damp wood, among ships rocking at the docks and rumors of distant battles. His father, Ion Marinescu, had arrived in that city after fleeing from a violent altercation with an officer, and in that crossing of routes and escapes was forged the blood of Alexander, destined for a life marked by the sea and the tempest. From childhood he was drawn to what lay beyond the coast, the ships that were lost on the horizon, the sails that disappeared at dawn, the promise of a world where risk was constant. He soon abandoned school and at 15 years old was already working as a cabin boy on a merchant ship. There he learned the brutal discipline of maritime life, days without rest, hands hardened by rope and iron, moonless nights where only the murmur of the waves remained. That first apprenticeship was the mold of his character, a man who clung to life always risking a little more than necessary. He soon stood out, not for his obedience but for his audacity. He volunteered for what others avoided, risked too much in storms and departures, showed himself willing to face what seemed impossible. Thus he entered navigation schools, where he became a naval officer, no longer only as a merchant sailor, but as part of the Soviet military machinery. His training as a submariner was harsh, at a time when the Soviet Union sought to modernize its fleet under the shadow of German battleships. He learned to launch torpedoes in icy waters, to remain motionless for hours in evasion exercises, to calculate trajectories in seconds under the stalking of enemy destroyers. His training was not theoretical. Each instruction patrol was a reminder that one mistake meant dying without trace under the water. There he became a capable professional, but also a man who did not lose his independent character, someone who preferred long hours at the periscope, concentrated on the horizon rather than the comfort of the officers' camaraderie. The war forged him in steel. When in 1941 Germany invaded the Soviet Union, reality ceased to be training and became survival. Marinesko was in command of the submarine M96 in the Baltic Fleet. It was a small ship of limited range, but enough to participate in the first patrols. In one of them, the M96 suffered severe damage from German fire and was put out of service for months. That parenthesis weakened the crew, sank morale, and also exposed the dark side of its commander. Alcohol became habitual, absences and arguments with superiors multiplied. Rumors of indiscipline began to pursue him. In the records of his unit appear contradictory notes: a brave commander, rewarded for his attacks, and at the same time a difficult officer, labeled as unreliable for higher responsibilities. That duality would mark his entire life. Even so, his flashes of brilliance were impossible to ignore. He attacked convoys, landed reconnaissance commandos on enemy coasts, earned a reputation for being daring. His way of being did not change. Marinesko was a direct, temperamental, proud man who did not fear risking his crew if with it he could deliver a decisive blow. The sea became the stage where he expressed himself most naturally. There, far from the officers, he was master of every decision. The decisive moment came with the command of the submarine S-13, a Stalinets of greater size and power, armed with long-range torpedoes and with autonomy to cover the entire Baltic. It was 1945, and the waters of that region were full of refugees, wounded, and German soldiers fleeing the Soviet advance. It was Operation Hannibal, the greatest naval evacuation in history, and in that transit of millions of people were mixed combatants, civilians, women, and children. Marinesko, after having been on the verge of a court-martial for his problems of discipline, received the mission of attacking those routes. In the tension between his personal discredit and the need for results, his future was at stake. On the 30th of January of 1945, while patrolling off the coast of Kolberg, he sighted through the periscope the Wilhelm Gustloff, a huge ocean liner converted into a transport for refugees and military personnel. The scene in the submarine was of absolute concentration, the crew in silence, breath held, waiting for the order. Marinesko calculated the speed, adjusted the depth of the torpedoes, measured the enemy escort, and launched. 3 torpedoes struck directly. 1 got stuck, but no more was needed. In a matter of minutes, the giant began to sink. The corridors flooded, the boats collapsed, thousands of people were trapped. More than 9,000 died in that single night, a figure that surpasses that of any other maritime disaster of war. Meanwhile, inside the S-13, the commander watched through the periscope the Colossus list turn and disappear into the darkness of the sea. He gave no speeches, did not celebrate. His coldness was that of someone who had fulfilled his mission and who knew that that attack would return him prestige. The silence of his crew was the other side, men aware that they had written one of the bloodiest pages in naval history. Weeks later, on the 10th of February, Marinesko repeated the operation against the Stuben, another ship crowded with refugees and wounded. The maneuver was similar. Stealthy approach, torpedo attack, subsequent evasion. The result was another tragedy with thousands of victims. In a little more than 10 days, Marinesko had sunk 2 ships with a death toll close to 14,000 people. No other submarine commander in history carried such a figure. That record made him a legend, though not a glorious life. His personal behavior continued to clash with the Soviet ideal. The High Command looked at him with suspicion, considered that his drinking bouts and his romances with Finnish women made him unworthy of being a model hero. Despite his successes, he never received at that time the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. The post-war treated him harshly. He was demoted, removed from service, persecuted by the military bureaucracy that never forgave his unruly character. He worked in minor trades, lived years of marginalization, and died in 1963 without official recognition. It was not until 1990, in the midst of Soviet openness, that he was finally granted the title that had been denied to him. By then, history had already turned his sinkings into a symbol. The commander who, with a mixture of audacity, talent, and coldness, had sunk more lives than anyone else from the depths. Marinesko was a man crossed by contradictions, brave and reckless, disciplined in combat but undisciplined in life, technically brilliant and humanly tormented. His rigorous training had given him the tools to become an implacable submarine hunter, but his character set him apart from the heroic mold. He was a sailor who found meaning only in war, in the instant when the periscope revealed his prey and the silence of the sea awaited the roar of the torpedoes. That combination of military efficiency and personal turbulence makes him a fascinating and dark figure, hero to some, criminal to others, but above all a man who took submarine warfare to the extreme of the imaginable. Tatsunosuke Ariizumi, the bloodthirsty Japanese. When the war was already raging in the Indian Ocean, when the merchant ships became a mirage at dawn, Ariizumi rose in command of the I-8, a large, powerful submarine capable of covering long distances and attacking with torpedoes and deck weapons. Under his command, which began on the 15th of January of 1944, the I-8 became not only a machine of naval destruction, but a brutal instrument of direct violence against defenseless castaways. His command implied not only sinking ships, but punishing, torturing, executing, leaving swimming those who had barely escaped the initial death. The I-8 was already a formidable piece, Junsen 3 class, originally designed for extensive operations, even to carry seaplanes with good autonomy, good speed, and decent armament. But what made it fearsome under Ariizumi was not so much its size, but how this commander transformed each sortie into a test of systematic cruelty. One of the most atrocious cases occurred on the 26th of March of 1944 with the SS Chisalak, a Dutch ship with a mixed crew, Dutch, British, Chinese passengers, as well as some armed defenders, though with little capacity to repel a submarine attack. Ariizumi ordered torpedoes to be launched. The Chisalak was hit, seriously damaged, forcing the crew to abandon the ship in lifeboats and rafts. Here the real terror already began. The I-8 surfaced, approached the survivors. It was not enough to see them struggle against the waves. The men, many wounded, were taken, literally pulled from the water, brought to the deck of the submarine, forced, tied in pairs, beaten with hammers, wrenches, even swords. Some were massacred in public, others were machine-gunned while floating in the water. Men who had just escaped the sinking were punished for having survived. It is reported that some officers behaved with coldness, with sordidness. Scenes were filmed, they laughed while firing rifles at swimming castaways. In the end, very few survived. Of the approximate 100 on board, only 5 or 6 managed to escape and were later rescued by an Allied ship. Not many days passed before Ariizumi repeated the scene with the Jean Nicolet, an American Liberty-style ship with passengers and military-armed crew, cargo, etc. On the 2nd of July of 1944, the I-8 torpedoed it. No one expected mercy. The survivors who fled in rafts and boats were forced to board the I-8. The officers, the passengers, the civilians, all mixed. Ariizumi ordered that they be tied, stripped of their life jackets, of their valuable belongings. Brutal interrogations began with physical violence, beatings. Some were executed directly. Others were moved from rafts to the deck of the submarine only to be thrown into the sea. In some cases, Ariizumi forced men to witness the deaths of their companions before it was their turn, all under death threats. Afterwards, when the submarine detected that a plane was approaching, Ariizumi ordered an abrupt dive, leaving on the surface the survivors tied, unable to swim or free themselves. Many drowned simply because they were deliberately abandoned. Those who managed to be rescued did so after many hours, some even more than a day. These events were not isolated aberrations, but part of a policy of terror under the command of Ariizumi. Records indicate that he himself encouraged the violence. He not only gave orders, but participated morally, at times physically, encouraging his crew, ensuring that the punishment was public, exemplary. He was not a commander who preferred distance or to delegate these tasks. Brutality was part of his way of operating. It was necessary for him to show that whoever escaped the main attack would not survive beyond the shadow of the I-8. The context favored him. The Indian Ocean in 1944 was full of vulnerable targets, unescorted transports, merchant ships loaded with troops, supplies, displaced civilians. Ariizumi had been trained in the Imperial Navy: strict discipline, iron obedience, technical knowledge of torpedoes, naval mechanics, stealth maneuvers, night navigation, escort detection. His training qualified him for combat, but his psychology pushed him beyond duty. He was not content with sinking ships. He sought humiliation, revenge, horror. Thus, Ariizumi embodied a bloodthirsty commander, a person who not only planned naval attacks with precision, as befits a well-trained officer, but who added to the technical calculation the deliberate brutality against human beings already defeated by shipwreck. That mixture of professional training and conscious sadism makes him distinctive. There is no doubt that he knew the conventions of war, or at least the rule of protecting castaways, but he chose to ignore it. He not only ignored the suffering, he extended it, turned it into part of the psychological strategy, to sow terror in those who traveled unarmed, in those who expected to be rescued. The end came with the surrender of Japan, but Ariizumi avoided fully facing justice. He committed suicide in August of 1945 on board the I-401 while it was heading to surrender, perhaps evading arrest or trial. Some of his men were judged after the war. 3 members of the I-8 under his command were located. One received immunity in exchange for testimony, the others condemned, but their sentences ended up being commuted later. The legacy of Ariizumi is that of a commander who transformed submarine warfare into something more than sinkings, into a lesson of horror. He not only killed by strategy, he executed death upon the castaways as if victory were not enough until erasing every trace of mercy. Hajime Nakagawa, massacring even hospital ships. In the waters of the South Pacific, when there still remained the illusion that certain ships were protected by the Red Cross painted on their hulls, the name of Hajime Nakagawa emerged, a Japanese commander who would shatter the notion of humanity in naval war. His trajectory shows him as an officer trained under the strict school of the Imperial Navy, disciplined in the technical but blind in the moral, capable of turning sinking into deliberate extermination. In May of 1943, Nakagawa was in command of the submarine I-177, a Kaidai-type submersible with good range and armament. From his tower he sighted a particular target off the east coast of Australia, the hospital ship AHS Centaur. The ship, clearly marked with the International Red Cross, carried medical personnel and nurses, not combat troops. The logic of war, even in its brutality, would have considered it untouchable. But Nakagawa did not see a symbol of aid. He saw a target. He ordered the torpedoes launched, and in seconds the Centaur burned and sank. 281 people died, among them dozens of doctors and nurses. Only 64 managed to survive. It was not a mistake, nor a tactical confusion. Testimonies indicate that the Centaur was visible with all the corresponding markings, illuminated so that there would be no doubts. The attack was a flagrant violation of international conventions, a war crime without mitigation. Submarine warfare, however cruel it might be, had implicit codes: to attack combatants, block routes, sink enemy transport. Nakagawa's gesture broke that line, showed contempt for any limit, made the sea a territory where no one, not even the wounded and the medical personnel, was safe. That action, which in Australia was recorded as one of the worst crimes in its waters, revealed a cold-blooded commander, imperturbable before the idea of sinking civilians and medical personnel, as if they were a military convoy. But Nakagawa's record did not stop there. In February of 1944, in command of the I-37, he repeated the brutality, this time against the British tanker British Chivalry in the Indian Ocean. After torpedoing it, he allowed part of the crew to throw themselves into the sea. The survivors floated in boats and improvised rafts, some trying to cling to pieces of the hull. It was then that Nakagawa ordered to surface. The submarine appeared on the surface, approaching slowly, like a predator savoring the prey already defeated. The men in the water raised their hands, shouted, some pleaded. But the commander did not seek prisoners nor even witnesses. From the deck, the automatic weapons were opened, machine-gunning directly the shipwrecked. Several died instantly. Others sank, wounded amid the waves. The fire did not cease until the waters were splashed with bodies. The few who survived did so by swimming for hours, until later being rescued by Allied ships. The difference between sinking and murdering is thin at sea, but in that episode the difference was marked with violence. The ship had already disappeared. The combat mission was accomplished. What followed was the execution of defenseless human beings. Nakagawa had made of his submarine not a weapon of war, but a mobile executioner. His training explains in part how he reached that point. The Japanese Imperial Navy instilled a discipline of steel, an extreme nationalism, and a deep contempt for the enemies, seen as less than human. Nakagawa absorbed those lessons and took them to the extreme. Unlike other commanders who concentrated on tactical effectiveness, he made cruelty part of the process. It was not enough to sink a ship, it was necessary to erase its survivors. That mentality turned the I-177 and the I-37 into names feared not for their technical capacity, but for the certainty that under his command death reached beyond the first impact. Nakagawa's end was not glorious. After the war in 1946, he was captured and brought before an Allied tribunal for the sinking of the Centaur and the massacre of the British Chivalry. His fate was condemnation and execution, although the echo of his actions continued marking the memory of the seas where he acted. In Australia, each anniversary of the sinking of the Centaur is remembered as a brutal crime that crossed every limit. Nakagawa embodies the figure of the bloodthirsty commander in the purest sense, a man trained to fight, who chose to employ that training not only in the destruction of military targets, but in the deliberate annihilation of civilian lives and survivors. His patrols were not strategic victories, but human tragedies, and where others could find justification in the confusion of war, he made clear that his acts were of his own will, executed with coldness, without remorse, as if the sea should swallow even the last castaway. Heinz Eck, the crimes of the U-852. He had learned the trade with German patience. He entered as a cadet of Crew 34, sailed in minesweepers, and only in 1942 did he fully enter the submarine force. He did his training patrol in the U-124, the hard school of the Atlantic, and on the 15th of June of 1943 he received his own command, the U-8-152, a large Type 9D2, slow to submerge, heavy, powerful, and for that very reason vulnerable if he made a mistake. In Peleus, they refined him in torpedoes, long-range navigation, and silence procedures. Before sailing toward the Indian Ocean, veterans like Schnee and Meul warned him, in the South Atlantic, Allied aviation sweeps every mile. Any field of wreckage betrays your position for days. That warning, meant to save the crew, would twist the moral fate of his career. He departed from Kiel on the 18th of January of 1944 with an Asian mission. He had to cross the Atlantic, round the Cape, and enter the Indian Ocean to cut lines toward the Far East. It was a journey of total discretion to avoid any combat that left traces, to sink only when the risk was minimal. On the night of the 13th of March, off Freetown, Eck saw a Greek merchant ship sailing alone, the SS Peleus. He followed it until full darkness, closed to firing range, and launched 2 torpedoes at short distance. In 3 minutes, the ship split like a shell. There remained planks, barrels, rafts, bodies on the water. At that moment, doctrine and fear prevailed. Such a field of wreckage could summon bombers. Eck decided to sweep the scene. He ordered machine gunning of the remains and throwing grenades to shatter wood, boats, and everyone who was upon them. The hunt lasted hours. When the U-852 withdrew, in the sea only 3 men survived, of a crew of 35, who adrift would, a month later, be rescued by a Portuguese ship. The account of those survivors is dry. The submarine surfaced, approached, fired. They were called on board, interrogated and returned to the rafts to then continue breaking by gunfire everything that floated. On the German side, the logbook, which Eck would not manage to destroy, would fix times and movements with that bureaucratic coldness so typical of industrial war: sinking, interrogation, destruction of vestiges. The tactical objective, to leave no signals, ended up converted into execution of castaways. That night sealed his fate. The voyage continued southward. On the 1st of April, off Cape Town, he sank the Dahomean and this time did not attack the survivors. Perhaps because the sea and sky were no longer his, perhaps because the decision of March had crossed a line he did not need to cross again. Even so, the mission deteriorated quickly. On the 30th of April, a Wellington from Aden surprised him in the Indian Ocean. The charges left him without ability to submerge. Eck set course for the Somali coast and, under the harassment of planes from the 621 Squadron, beached the U-852 on a coral shoal about 20 miles from land. 7 men were left in the sea. The rest reached the beach to surrender shortly afterwards to the Somaliland Camel Corps. On board, a British patrol would find the KTB, the War Diary, and even a Faye 330 observation autogyro, proofs, metal and ink that survived where gunpowder and self-destruction explosives failed. Until then, Eck was an efficient officer, trained in minesweeping and instructed in U-boat orthodoxy. But in Hamburg, in October-November of 1945, it was no longer his technical skill that was judged, but his decision to kill castaways. The Peleus trial before a British military tribunal gathered pieces difficult to refute: the recovered KTB confessions and, above all, the testimonies of the 3 rescued Greeks. Eck's defense was merciless with himself. He argued operational necessity, cited the Laconia Order as part of the context, not to assist sunk crews, spoke of the risk that the rafts had radios. The tribunal was more succinct: destroying rafts and inhabited remains is killing. Guilt proven. He was not alone in the dock. The first officer, August Hoffmann, and the ship's doctor, Walter Weiss-Pfennig, also received the death penalty. The chief engineer, Hans Lenz, who had resisted executing the order but ended up replacing a petty officer who refused, received life imprisonment. The machinist, Wolfgang Schwender, 15 years. Lenz and Schwender would be freed in 1952 and 1951, respectively. Eck and his 2 officers were executed on the 30th of November of 1945. He was 29 years old. What pushed Eck to that decision? His trajectory allows one to see the intention outlined over a very concrete tactical fear. In the engine room of a Type 9 D2, all knew that the greatest danger came from above. Radar, searchlights, a plane with charges, and there was no U-boat left to tell it. The cleaning of the site of the sinking was a commented practice, not written, in talks among commanders. Aviation detected fields of wreckage, and from 1943 the Atlantic no longer forgave. In his mind, eliminating evidence could preserve the boat, but there the reasoning breaks. One thing is to sink wood and barrels, another is to sustain fire for hours against occupied rafts and men in sight. From the calculation of survival to cruelty, there is an ethical and operational decision proper to the commander. No general order, nor Laconia, nor the statistics of sightings imposed on him to turn that night into a massacre. The British process fixed three ideas that since then weigh upon naval combat. First, there is no military necessity that legitimizes firing against castaways. Second, following orders does not excuse the officer who retains margin of decision. Third, the logbook rules. Without the KTB, the Peleus affair would have remained a high-sea rumor. With it, the chronology of the crime became minute by minute, and the defense was left without fog. It is an almost literary point. The document that must give continuity to command ended up being the rope of the officer who believed he was obeying the logic of his arm. There is, moreover, a contrast that makes his profile sharper. In the Dahomean, there was no fire against rafts. The mission pressed, the Indian Ocean called, and the U-852 sailed away. Why with the Peleus, then? Everything points to the combination of operational debut in the fully patrolled zone, to the psychology of the first clash, and to the obsession with leaving no trace. That mixture turned a prudential recommendation into a criminal policy, in fact. Eck was not a sadist by the book, nor a trainer in cruelty. He was a commander who, before a concrete uncertainty, chose the worst possible path and sustained it long enough to erase any extenuation. The closure of his military history was as harsh as it was brief. The capture of the U-852, beached and torn apart by bombs in the Horn of Africa, had something of a metaphor. A giant designed to cross oceans surrendered on a tongue of coral. From the wreck, in addition to the KTB, the British retrieved a FAR 330, a kite autogyro which, hoisted by the submarine on the surface, gave hawk's eye at dozens of meters. Cutting-edge technology for a command that ended up in law school. There in Hamburg, the case fixed jurisprudence. The rules of the sea in the Second World War had been left in tatters. The tribunal set about sewing with sentences its minimal edges. There remains the human trace which neither absolves nor aggravates but explains the depth of a command. The young man who learned to sweep mines, who wanted to be part of the submarine elite, carried on his shoulders the ghosts of 1009, 143-44, radars, lee lights, escorts, the loss of the Atlantic night. In that climate, each commander built his own limit. Eck pushed it beyond what was permitted and did so in full awareness of what was happening under his periscope. That is why his name is not remembered for tonnage, but for the will to continue firing when the combat had already ended. And that is why his story is not that of the tragic hero who falls for a technical error, but that of the officer who turned a tactical prudence into a war crime. Mokitsura Hashimoto, the shadow of the Indianapolis. He had spent years immersed in the rigorous discipline of the Japanese Imperial Navy. Mokitsura Hashimoto was an officer forged in the hardness of the training with Type 1 submarines, huge ships designed for oceanic operations, slower compared to the agile German hunters, but with enough autonomy and power to cross entire seas. His training had been meticulous, hours of simulation at periscopes, obsessive study of torpedo trajectories, tide calculations, evasion exercises under the threat of destroyers. He was a commander convinced that war was defined by technical precision and by the serenity of the one who pulls the trigger without hesitation. In July of 1945, in command of the I-58, he received news that a great American ship would cross the Pacific. It was the USS Indianapolis, a heavy cruiser of the Portland class. Hashimoto sighted it on the 29th of July near the Philippines. The sea was calm, the night was dense, and the periscope outlined the imposing silhouette of the vessel. Hashimoto evaluated the situation. There was no escort. The ship sailed alone, confident. It was the perfect target. He adjusted angles, calculated speed, depths, waited for the exact moment. When he gave the order to launch 6 Type 95 torpedoes, 2 struck violently. The Indianapolis split apart in a matter of minutes. From his command post, Hashimoto observed the explosion, the fire, the structure leaning toward the abyss. He knew the blow had been devastating. He did not stay to contemplate. He ordered to dive to avoid retaliation. In his mind, he had fulfilled the duty that justified his entire career, sinking a significant military target. What he did not know at that moment, what he never measured in his calculations, was the human magnitude of that decision. The Indianapolis carried more than 1,100 men. In barely 12 minutes, the ship disappeared. Hundreds died instantly. Those who survived remained floating in the ocean in the middle of a nightmare that would last for days. Hashimoto had struck without knowing that that cruiser had just delivered in Tinian the parts of the first atomic bomb. He could not imagine that his attack would intertwine with the fate of Hiroshima. What he did leave was a tragedy, almost 900 men fighting against thirst, sunstroke, hallucinations, and above all, the sharks that fed without rest on exhausted bodies. When they were rescued days later, barely 316 remained alive. Hashimoto learned later of the scope of what had happened. In his own report, he acknowledged the sinking as a legitimate military success. He had attacked a warship, not a hospital, not a civilian transport. However, in the post-war period, the figure of the Indianapolis acquired mythical dimensions, and with it, the name of its attacker. The United States sought those responsible and found one of its own, Captain Charles McVeigh, accused of not maneuvering in a zigzag. But in McVeigh's trial appeared as unexpected witness Hashimoto himself. Before the tribunal, with cold serenity, he declared that nothing McVeigh could have done would have changed the result. The I-58 had the cruiser in inescapable conditions. His words, thought with technical honesty, became a paradox, the enemy defending the adversary. Hashimoto's life after the attack was marked by that shadow. In Japan, he was recognized as a dutiful commander without the bloodthirsty excesses of other colleagues who had fired upon castaways. But in international memory, his name remained tied to the greatest disaster in the naval history of the United States. He was seen with distrust, with hatred, even with icy respect. The man who, with a periscope and a calculation, had sent more than 800 sailors to die in the open sea. Hashimoto himself carried that awareness. At the end of the war, he wrote his memoirs, narrating from his perspective what had happened. It was not a story of repentance. It was the testimony of a professional who had fulfilled what was expected of him. He never denied the attack, never justified it as anything other than war. But neither could he escape the consequences. Until his death in 2000, American veterans saw him as the ultimate responsible for that tragedy. The sinking of the Indianapolis was not a war crime. It was a military attack on a valid target. But the human consequence was so immense that it placed Hashimoto in the gallery of the most lethal submarine commanders of the Second World War. From his point of view, that 29th of July was the culmination of years of discipline and training. From the perspective of history, it was the condemnation of hundreds of men to the liquid hell of the Pacific. And there resides the paradox. Hashimoto did not kill with sadism, like Ariizumi or Nakagawa, but with exact calculation and cold obedience. And yet his name remained as engraved in the memory of the survivors as that of the most bloodthirsty. Wolfgang Lüth, the methodical predator. In the gallery of submarine aces, the name of Wolfgang Lüth occupies a special place. He was not a commander carried away by fits of improvised brutality. His was methodical coldness, calculated hunting, the systematic exercise of the trade of killing at sea. In his almost 5 years of war, he sank 47 ships that added up to more than 225,000 tons, which made him the second greatest gunner of the Kriegsmarine, only behind Otto Kretschmer. His training explains it in part. He entered the Reichsmarine in 1933, was forged in the discipline of the Naval Academy of Mürwik, and soon stood out for a rare mixture of charisma and tactical obsession. He had what the Germans called Führungsqualität, capacity for command. He was meticulous, demanding, attentive to every technical detail, but also a man who radiated confidence and kept his crew in constant tension. For him, each patrol was an exercise in perfection, locating, approaching, launching torpedoes with surgical precision, and withdrawing without leaving traces. What made him different was not only his effectiveness, but the way in which he understood submarine warfare as an art of annihilation. Lüth did not hesitate to attack solitary ships or convoys by day or by night with torpedoes or with deck guns. On several occasions after sinking merchant ships, he surfaced to observe the castaways from the bridge, calculating the scene as one who evaluates a job well done. There is no record that he gave the explicit order to machine gun survivors like Ariizumi or Eck, but there was a coldness that for those who knew him was just as disturbing, total indifference to human suffering. His only interest was the tonnage statistic, the prestige that number granted in Berlin, and the reward of medals that were not long in coming, Iron Cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds, the highest decoration that the Kriegsmarine awarded. Aboard the U-181, his favorite base of operations, Lüth developed an almost industrial hunting routine. He left nothing to chance. He trained his officers to repeat maneuvers again and again, demanded absolute silence in dives, and punished the slightest distraction. Those who sailed with him remembered the oppressive atmosphere as if each error were a mortal sin. And yet, that pressure kept the submarine functioning with relentless precision. In the Indian Ocean, in 1943 and 1944, his attacks were devastating against British convoys and solitary ships that tried to maintain the flow with the colonies. There, far from the stricter Allied surveillance, Lüth found his ideal terrain to inflict massive losses without immediate fear of reprisals. The most disturbing thing was how his character blended with ideology. Lüth was a convinced National Socialist. Unlike other commanders who kept political distance, he embodied blind loyalty to Hitler and the German cause. He truly believed that each ship sunk was one more step toward victory, and that the thousands of merchant sailors killed were necessary sacrifices. There was no moral dilemma, no room for doubt, only the certainty that his duty was to destroy. That conviction made him a propaganda symbol. Goebbels exhibited him as a model hero, the young officer who dominated the ocean and remained faithful to the Führer. Lüth accepted that exposure without qualms, convinced that he represented the elite of the elite. His conferences in Berlin were acclaimed, his image appeared in magazines and newsreels, and his name was used to inspire new generations of cadets. But behind that image of hero was a cold man, for whom the hundreds of sailors who died after each torpedo were simple figures in a war report. Destiny reserved him an abrupt end. He survived the war, even rose to the direction of the Naval Academy of Merwick, and seemed destined to be one of the pillars of post-war Germany. But in May of 1945, just days after capitulation, he was mistakenly shot by a German sentry at the academy itself who did not recognize his figure in the darkness. A hero of the Third Reich, fallen not in combat, but by a German bullet fired in the confusion of collapse. In retrospect, the story of Wolfgang Lüth is not marked by a punctual crime like that of Ariizumi or Eck, but by the cold sum of his acts. He was a methodical killer, a predator who turned submarine warfare into an exact calculation, and who never allowed compassion to interfere with his duty. That coldness, joined to his ideological fanaticism, makes him one of the most bloodthirsty commanders of the Second World War, not so much for a singular atrocious act, but for the icy constancy with which he multiplied death at sea. Fritz-Julius Lemp, the commander who inaugurated the war with civilian blood. In the first hours of the Second World War, when the illusion still floated that the conflict could be limited to continental Europe, a German submarine opened the waters of the Atlantic with civilian blood. Its commander was Fritz-Julius Lemp, young officer of the Kriegsmarine, in command of the U-30. On the 3rd of September of 1939, barely 6 hours after Great Britain declared war on Germany, Lemp made a decision that would mark him forever, to fire against the British ocean liner SS Athenia. He had been trained in the rigorous German naval school, where the identification of targets was an almost sacred duty. The doctrine insisted distinguishing between merchant ships, auxiliary cruisers, and passenger transports was vital, not only militarily, but for political consequences. However, that afternoon in the North Atlantic, the tension and the excitement of the start of hostilities pushed him to act precipitously. Through the periscope, he believed he saw a vessel converted into an armed auxiliary, sailing with erratic course and with its lights off. He ordered torpedoes to be launched. One of the projectiles struck the side of the Athenia, opening a hole in the engine room. The explosion was brutal. The ship listed rapidly. The decks tilted and panic seized the passengers. There were more than 1,400 people on board, among them women, elderly, and more than 100 children. There was no prior warning, no signal shot, nor chance to evacuate calmly. The first civilian victim of the Atlantic fell without knowing that the world had just entered a total war. The scenes on deck were of absolute horror. The passengers ran among smoke and debris, some throwing themselves directly into the sea to escape the flames. The lifeboats overflowed, many sank before touching the water, others returned loaded beyond their capacity. The cries of the children mingled with the alarm sirens, while the Atlantic, cold and dark, began to swallow the ship. The U-30 remained at a distance, observing in silence. Lemp did nothing to aid the survivors, not even surfaced to assess the damage. His only concern was to move away and record the sinking in his logbook. He knew that what he had just done could not be easily justified. The Athenia was not a warship, and he had torpedoed it without any provocation. Rescue arrived thanks to British, Swedish and Norwegian ships that responded to the distress signals. The destroyer HMS Electra, the Escort and the Fame, along with neutral merchant ships, managed to save more than 1,300 people. However, 118 died, among them 28 United States citizens. Their bodies remained floating on the surface, mute witnesses that the war at sea had begun with a crime. In Berlin, the effect was immediate. Adolf Hitler and the High Command understood that this attack could drag the United States into the war prematurely. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, launched a desperate campaign. He claimed that the Athenia had been sunk by a British mine, or even by mistake of the Royal Navy itself. Documents were falsified, the logbook of the U-30 was altered, and a strict order was issued. From that moment on, no U-boat commander was to attack passenger ships under any circumstance. Lemp was reprimanded in private, but not brought before a military tribunal. The Kriegsmarine needed aggressive commanders and could not afford to sacrifice one of its own in the initial euphoria of the war. For months, the truth remained hidden. On the surface, Lemp continued his career as if nothing had happened. He sank merchant ships, participated in successful patrols, received the Iron Cross, and rose in prestige. But within the submarine fleet itself, his name was marked. Many of his colleagues looked at him with mistrust. He had been the man who opened the war by sinking a civilian ship, the one who placed the entire force at the center of an international scandal. In 1941, he received a new command, the U-110, a modern Type 9B submarine, with which he sailed into the Atlantic to cut British supply lines. On the 9th of May of that year, near Iceland, the U-110 was hunted by the destroyers HMS Bulldog and HMS Broadway, along with the corvette HMS Obratia. After a series of depth charges, the submarine surfaced heavily damaged. Lemp ordered his crew to abandon the vessel, convinced that it would sink soon. He himself attempted to return aboard to open flooding valves and sink it definitively, but he never returned. The British achieved the unthinkable. They boarded the U-110 and captured it practically intact. Inside, they found the Enigma machine and crucial documents of naval codes. This intelligence breakthrough allowed the Allies to decipher the communications of the Kriegsmarine and marked a before and after in the Battle of the Atlantic. Lemp's error, his inability to destroy the submarine in time, was as decisive as the torpedo he had launched against the Athenia 2 years earlier. The fate of Lemp was ambiguous. According to some testimonies, he died by gunfire from a British ship when attempting to return to his vessel. Others claim that he drowned in the sea, exhausted by the current and the weight of his clothes. His body was never recovered. He was only 27 years old. The story of Fritz-Julius Lemp is that of a talented commander, but one marked by fatal decisions. At the beginning of the war, he chose to sink a passenger ship and bore the stigma of being responsible for the first civilian massacre in the Atlantic. In his end, he lost not only his life, but also the best-kept secret of the Kriegsmarine. Between those two shores stretches a trajectory where technical coldness and lack of scruples combined to seal his name in the list of the bloodiest submarine commanders of the Second World War. Helmut Witte, a bloodthirsty wolf in the Caribbean. The name of the U-159 is not as well known as that of the U-47 of Prien or the U-96 of Lehmann-Willenbrock. However, in the list of the deadliest submarines of the Second World War, it occupies a sinister place. Its commander, Captain Lieutenant Helmut Witte, sank with it nearly 120,000 tons of ships in barely 3 patrols. The figure placed him in the circle of aces of the Kriegsmarine, but his reputation was not founded solely on statistics. He also earned the stigma of having shown a particular cruelty toward the survivors of the ships he attacked. Witte was not an improvised man. Formed in the iron discipline of the Reichsmarine of the 1930s, he had passed through the rigors of the Mürwik School and had served on destroyers before being transferred to the submarine force. That transition shaped him as an officer who understood the sea both on its surface and beneath it. Unlike other colleagues who maintained a cold distance, Witte transmitted to his crew a somber enthusiasm. He believed in submarine warfare as a hunt, and in that vision there was no place for compassion. The U-159, a Type 9C, departed on its first patrol in 1942 toward the Caribbean. These were the days of the so-called Second Happy Time, when the Kriegsmarine extended its operations to the American coasts. The Atlantic was still poorly defended, and the waters off Panama, Venezuela, or Trinidad were a feast of easy targets. In that first incursion, Witte attacked with cannon small coastal merchant ships, setting them on fire in broad daylight, forcing the crews to jump into the water en route. Several times he surfaced to inspect the remains, and surviving witnesses later declared that the submariners fired against lifeboats to disperse or sink them, seeking to eliminate signals that could reveal the attack. On the 15th of June of 1942, off Panama, the U-159 sank the American tanker San Pablo. It was not a clean attack. After the torpedoing, the ship remained burning, with crew struggling to abandon deck. Witte ordered to surface and finish off the vessel with cannon fire, even though desperate men were still visible on the burning deck. The fire of the projectile struck not only the hull, but also several sailors who had not yet managed to jump. The few survivors remembered how the grey shadow of the submarine was outlined against the smoke, firing coldly until the ship sank completely. The second patrol in 1943 was even bloodier. Witte operated off South Africa and Mozambique, where merchant traffic was vital to supply the British Empire. On the 21st of February, he attacked the freighter Queen Anne. After sinking it, he approached the wreckage and, according to later Allied reports, machine-gunned rafts with survivors. There are no German records of that action. The Kriegsmarine never explicitly encouraged such practices, but the testimonies collected in British and South African reports insisted that the U-159 deliberately opened fire on shipwrecked men. Blair underlines that these accusations were not isolated. Other commanders of the Second Flotilla had received the tacit order of leaving no visible traces, which translated into firing upon rafts and timbers where men could remain afloat. Witte showed himself implacable. His obsession was the tonnage war, to sink ships in quantity and erase their traces. In his logic, a lifeboat adrift could become an improvised radio, a witness, an alert for Allied hunters. Thus, each attack was completed with a second act in which the boundary between tactic and crime blurred. During that same patrol, the U-159 sank several British merchant ships off Cape Town. One of the most remembered scenes occurred after the attack on the Robert Bacon, a transport loaded with weapons. The survivors launched distress signals, which Witte interpreted as a trap. He then ordered to fire against the rafts to disperse them. The few who escaped were rescued by South African ships days later, and their accounts coincided in describing the German commander as a man who did not hesitate to use the 105mm cannon against human beings. Witte's style of command was described by his crew as iron and obsessive. He allowed no relaxation in prolonged dives, punished errors with severity, and kept his officers in a constant state of alert. That pressure, however, sustained the efficiency of the crew. The U-159 achieved in total 23 ships, sunk in 3 patrols, adding nearly 120,000 tons. It was an impressive record, but stained by the brutality with which several of those attacks were carried out. The end of the U-159 came quickly. In July of 1943, as it returned from patrol to the base at Lorient, it was detected by a South African Catalina seaplane. The craft, flying under the midday sun, launched depth charges over the silhouette of the submarine that sailed on the surface. The impact was devastating. The hull broke and the U-159 sank with the 53 men of its crew. None survived. Helmut Witte disappeared with them, leaving no direct witnesses of his final orders. German propaganda extolled him as a fallen hero, a commander who had served with valor and had sunk enormous amounts of enemy tonnage. But in Allied reports remained another portrait, that of a man who not only sank ships but eliminated those who managed to escape. The contrast between both versions reflects the brutality of submarine warfare. For some, a relentless warrior. For others, a criminal of the open sea. Witte was never judged. His death preserved him from the fate that awaited other commanders like Eck or Muel. However, the weight of the testimonies of the survivors of his attacks places him among the most bloodthirsty of the war. The U-159, in barely 1 year of service, left behind a trail of death that goes beyond the numbers. It is the voices of sailors machine-gunned in rafts, of tankers burned with crew still aboard, of oceans stained with oil and blood. In the history of submarine warfare, Helmut Witte is an example of how far the logic of the tonnage war could go when ethical limits were erased. A capable, disciplined and efficient commander, but also a man who decided that the life of a castaway was worth less than the shadow of a possible Allied plane. That choice, repeated again and again, turned him into something more than a warrior. It turned him into an executioner in the waters of the Atlantic. Dudley "Mush" Morton, the criminal who was never judged. Dudley Walker, Mush. Morton emerged in the naval history of the United States as one of the most famous and at the same time most controversial submarine commanders of the Second World War. Born in 1907, his passage through the Naval Academy of Annapolis was not brilliant. He had a reputation as a rebel, irreverent, and of possessing a strong character that clashed with the rigid norms of the institution. However, that same rebelliousness became an asset when the war in the Pacific broke out. The Navy needed bold men capable of pushing to the limit a weapon that until 1942 had shown disappointing results. The USS Wahoo became the stage of that transformation. When Morton assumed command in December of 1942, the submarine was marked by the indecision of previous patrols, with few sinkings and demoralized crew. Morton changed everything in one blow. He was a charismatic, energetic leader who instilled confidence and demanded aggressiveness. His style broke with the prudence that had dominated many of his colleagues after the disaster of Pearl Harbor. In his first meeting with the crew, he pronounced words that defined his command. The Wahoo would not return home without sinkings. Morton's philosophy was founded on two pillars: always attack whenever there was an opportunity and annihilate any possibility of the enemy recovering. Under that commandment, he turned the Wahoo into a symbol of the American counterattack in the Pacific. In his first patrols, he launched himself against Japanese convoys, ventured into patrolled waters, and achieved resounding successes. The North American press began to present him as the Hunter of the Pacific, and his name was associated with the idea that the United States had regained the initiative at sea, but that aggressiveness had a dark reverse. On the 26th of January of 1943, during the third patrol of the Wahoo in the Bismarck Sea, Morton sighted the Japanese transport Buyo Maru of about 5,000 tons sailing with escort. The submarine maneuvered into attack position and launched its torpedoes. The impact was devastating. The transport stopped dead, listed, and began to sink. Men were thrown from the deck, rafts were cast into the water amid the chaos. Morton, observing through the periscope, smiled satisfied. Another success for the record. What came next turned that scene into one of the most controversial of the submarine war. Upon surfacing, Morton observed that in the water there were dozens of rafts and hundreds of castaways. He ordered approach. It was not a maneuver of rescue, not even of inspection. Morton gave the order to open fire with the deck machine guns and with rifles against the men in the water. His argument, which he would repeat to his crew, was simple: we will not let them fight again. He believed they were Japanese soldiers who could be rescued and returned to the front. Military logic in his mind justified the massacre. For hours, the machine guns of the Wahoo spewed fire upon defenseless bodies. The shots destroyed rafts, hit men who waved their arms in signs of supplication, dragged the wounded to the depths. The sea was dyed with blood amid the smell of gunpowder and smoke. Some crew members of the submarine, obeying the orders, fired without hesitation. Others did so with doubts, disturbed by the scene. In the memoirs of several survivors of the Wahoo, the heavy silence that seized the submarine after the shooting remained engraved. What Morton ignored, or did not want to verify, was who those victims really were. The Buyo Maru transported around 1,100 men, of whom about 450 were Japanese soldiers, but the majority, about 600–150, were Indian prisoners of war captured in Singapore and forced to work for the Japanese Empire. Those men, allies of the British, were chained to a cruel destiny in the hold of the ship. Upon sinking, many died trapped. Those who managed to reach the sea were then victims of American fire. The paradox was macabre. An American submarine, in the name of the war against Japan, was murdering captive Allied soldiers. The attack on the Buyo Maru was recorded in the Wahoo's patrol diary with a coldness that contrasted with the brutality of the facts. Morton noted having sunk an enemy transport and shot down numerous Japanese soldiers in the water. He did not mention the Indian prisoners. That omission, voluntary or not, was part of the logic of the time. What mattered were the tons sunk, not the circumstances of the dead. The news of the sinking of the Buyo Maru was celebrated in the United States as a triumph. The Navy propagated the image of Morton as a bold commander who let no enemies escape. He was decorated, and his following patrols received wide media coverage. No one in the high command wanted to dig deeper into the rumors about the attack on the castaways. It was more convenient to turn Morton into a hero than to analyze the nuances of his decisions. On a human level, however, the memory of the 26th of January weighed on some of his men. Several later testimonies spoke of recurring nightmares, of the discomfort of having fired upon defenseless people. In the corridors of the Navy, the topic became taboo. Morton himself never showed remorse. He always justified his order in the need to prevent the enemies from returning to combat. He was the embodiment of the brutal pragmatism of submarine warfare in the Pacific. The rest of the career of the Wahoo was as brief as it was dazzling. Under Morton, the submarine became one of the most feared of the Pacific Fleet. It sank transports, warships, and merchant ships in Japanese waters, operating in increasingly dangerous zones. Morton insisted on taking risks, on approaching even the very mouths of ports, on penetrating enemy patrols. His motto was clear: absolute audacity. But that audacity ended up costing him his life. In October of 1943, the Wahoo entered the Sea of Japan in a most risky patrol. On the 11th of October, it was detected and attacked by Japanese planes and anti-submarine forces. Bombs and depth charges destroyed it in shallow waters. Morton and all his crew died, trapped in the vessel he had turned into legend. The figure of Mush Morton was immortalized in North American memory as that of a naval hero. The Navy officially credited him with more than 20 enemy ships sunk and placed him in the pantheon of submarine aces. His name baptized schools, buildings, and commemorative plaques. The episode of the Buyo Maru was barely mentioned for decades, relegated to a footnote. Only with time, when the archives were opened and the testimonies compared, did the attack against the Indian prisoners come to light as a war crime. Today, the story of Morton moves between admiration and condemnation. Admiration for his capacity to transform a grey submarine into a feared and respected weapon. Condemnation for the decision to fire upon defenseless men, violating the naval code that prohibited attacking castaways. That contradiction reflects the spirit of a war in which the line between glory and crime was too thin, and where a commander could be celebrated as hero in his homeland while his acts left indelible scars in the waters of the other side of the world. In the memory of submarine warfare, Morton represents the fiercest and most ambiguous side of the conflict. A charismatic, bold leader who raised the prestige of the US Navy, but who also stained his name with the blood of those who never should have been his enemies. The Bismarck Sea, where the bodies of hundreds of prisoners floated after the sinking of the Buyo Maru, remains a mute witness of that day. There forever remained the echo of the Wahoo's machine guns, symbol of a crime that amid the din of war was disguised as victory. The other criminals. The Second World War was plagued with crimes at sea that never reached the courts. The submarine commanders, both of the Axis and of the Allies, often faced dilemmas in which the line between legitimate military action and barbarity was blurred. Many of those episodes remained hidden under the haze of propaganda or were justified as war necessities, and their responsible were never called to account. One of the most notorious cases occurred in the South Atlantic with the U-156 of Werner Hartenstein during the sinking of the Laconia in September of 1942. Although Hartenstein tried to rescue the castaways, the result was a tragedy of more than 1,600 dead, the majority Italian prisoners and civilians. The subsequent Laconia Order of Dönitz prohibited commanders from aiding survivors, institutionalizing cruelty. No one answered before a tribunal for that decision, which sealed the fate of thousands of sailors who, from then on, were abandoned on the high seas. Another example is that of the U-852 of Heinz Wilhelm Eck and the sinking of the Greek freighter Peleus in 1944. After torpedoing it in the waters of the Atlantic, Eck ordered machine gunning of the survivors and destruction of the remains to erase evidence. Unlike others, this case did reach trial in Hamburg in 1945 and Eck was executed, but what became clear is that his conviction was the exception. Other commanders committed similar acts without ever being prosecuted. In the Pacific, the I-8 Japanese submarine under the command of Tatsunosuke Ariizumi staged scenes of horror. In 1944, it captured the Dutch freighter Chisalak, forced its crew and passengers to form on deck and, after tortures, executed them with swords, bayonets, and machine gun fire. That same year, with the American freighter Jean Nicolet, Ariizumi repeated the pattern. He made the castaways disembark and murdered them one by one. Only a few survived to tell it. Ariizumi was never judged. He committed suicide in 1945, and with him died any possibility of justice. Something similar happened with the I-37 under the command of Hajime Nakagawa, responsible for machine gunning rafts after the sinking of the British tanker British Chivalry and of the Australian hospital ship Centaur in 1943. Attacking a hospital clearly marked with the Red Cross constituted a direct violation of international law. However, Nakagawa was never prosecuted. After the war, he returned to civilian life in Japan. Even among the Americans, there were shadows. The already mentioned Mush Morton of the Wahoo, celebrated as a hero, sank the Buyo Maru in 1943 and machine-gunned the survivors. Many of them were Indian prisoners of war under Japanese custody. This episode, which fit perfectly in the definition of war crime, was silenced by the United States Navy and remained buried in the heroic myth of Morton. In the Atlantic, commanders such as Helmut Witte of the U-159 accumulated testimonies of having fired against castaways in the Caribbean and off South Africa. The sinking of the tanker San Pablo in 1942 and other freighters were followed by cannon attacks against rafts, according to survivors' accusations. However, Witte died in 1943 along with his crew, and his responsibility was never formally investigated. The cases of Wolfgang Lüth, U-181, or of other aces of the Kriegsmarine show another angle. Although direct executions were not documented, their fanatical adherence to Nazi policy and their tactical coldness led to operations where thousands of civilians perished. Their names were exalted as war heroes in Germany, and any accusation about excesses was erased under the narrative of patriotic sacrifice. In all these episodes, a pattern is repeated. While some, like Eck, paid with their lives for crimes committed in evident and documented circumstances, the majority remained outside justice. Death in combat, suicide, protection of the national myth, or political convenience sealed the destiny of their legacies. The memory of survivors and of historians has been the only instance where those voices have found echo.